author of numerous articles, some of which have been translated into Turkish and French, I noticed on your CV. So have been translated into other languages, including a recent article in Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory entitled Zapatismo and the Global Origins of Occupy. He's also the author of the book Returning to Revolution, De Los Votare and Zapatismo, and has a forthcoming book from Stanford entitled The Figure of the Migrant. Is that? And then do you have another book project, The Theory of the Border?
Yeah.
Okay, so two in the stacks forthcoming.
Well, it's not forthcoming.
Okay, it's not placed yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so look for The Future of the Migrant, and then eventually Theory of the Border. And then just on a personal note, Dr. Nail is a great person to speak with about activism and theory. So if you have questions about that, I think he's a great interlocutor for that, has been in my experience. So please help me welcome Dr. Thomas Nail for Theory of the Border.
Thanks. Thank you guys so much for inviting me to your awesome department and so many cool events that are happening. I feel very honored to be one of the events on this excellent calendar. So I hope that my talk lives up to your expectations. I'm really happy to be here. So also let me thank everybody else for coming in on an uncharacteristically dark and rainy day. You've made it to this room, which is very nice. It's like cozy now that it's like so many people in it. It feels great.
Cave, but it's cozy cave.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. It feels better than like some big place with like just people scattered everywhere. So yeah, so thanks for everybody coming in. I know that everybody's time is valuable. And I have to first apologize very quickly that I'm gonna read this paper. I know that like I can't live up to the Chad Kautzer standard. I've seen Chad give many papers and he's just extemporaneous. Like he's like, yeah, I wrote a paper, and then he just sort of like goes forth and tells you everything in a very orderly way and time. Oh, it's done and it's on time roughly.
Now I have to do that.
Now I'm building more expectations on your talk, Chad. I can't live up. I just want to apologize. I can't live up to that. It's 45 minutes, maybe a lot for me to try to get this through and to get all the main points. So like Sarah was saying, just some context on this particular piece, Theory of the Border. So this is the first chapter of a book called Theory of the Border, and this is part of a sort of 3-volume series. The Figure of the Migrant is the first one, the Theory of the Border is the second one, and the third one is still under construction. This one's almost done. This one's like 80% of the way done. I was hoping to finish by the time I got here, so I'd have the final chapter, which is like all the nitty-gritty practical analysis of the U.S.-Mexico border wall, and that's what I was hoping to do more of that. But this will be sort of more of the framing and concepts of like how to develop a theory of the border, or how I'm going to do it. So that, yeah, and then the third volume is a book of metaphysics, and all 3 of these volumes, what they share in common is that they are a philosophy of movement and motion. So it's a kind of inversion of the classical categories of philosophy that privilege stasis, and instead and space and time, mind, and so on. Here I'm going to invert that and privilege movement, and then sort of draw out the consequences. 2 of the major consequences in political philosophy are a change in the figure and the ground of what we consider to be political philosophy. On the one hand, the migrant, so instead of privileging the citizen as the primary category that organizes political reality and so on, privileging instead the migrant, the figure of social movement and motion. And then the Theory of the Border is a change in the ground, so what we would normally consider to be static units of political philosophy, a society, their geography, in particular states. The history of states has sort of dominated that history. This will be an inversion of that. Instead of privileging states and analyzing political philosophy through the basis of states and how they organize their sovereignty and blah, 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 this is an analysis of the borders, which I want to argue are sort of constitutive of the state and should be a sort of prerequisite inquiry before showing that the state somehow created its borders, rather borders create the state. Okay. So I'm just going to sort of go into it now. So we live in a very bordered world. Maybe that's obvious. The daily news is filled with controversies concerning political, cultural, and economic borders that divide the world, our world. We live in a highly globalized world of constant movement and mobility, yet there are more types of social borders today than ever before in history. The social process of bordering now seems natural to us, but borders are not natural phenomena. They're socially and historically constituted forces. And the Theory of the Border, the larger project here, provides a philosophical history of the emergence of 4 major types of social borders, and then uses them to do a political analysis of contemporary border politics, and that's the U.S.-Mexico border analysis. That'll be the final chapter. My talk today is the first chapter. It's called Moving Borders. and that just sort of aims to provide the first part of a philosophical framework for advancing a theory of the border. And this is a sort of tricky question. So, first of all, the indexical question of what a border is sort of hard enough to answer on its own. I know that that sounds weird because it's intuitive, like what a border is, what states have borders, and so on. In the literature, this has become quite complicated. But the questions of also how, when, where, and who makes the border are just as crucial in determining what a border is. The wall, the cell, the checkpoint, the frontier, the limit, the march, the boundary. I mean, there's so many words that proliferate that distinguish different types and forms of borders. These are all distinct phenomena in political history, even if they do overlap with one another to some degree. For all their differences, these types of borders also share something in common. So the border, what I'm calling the border here, is the concept of that commonality. What all of the different types of borders throughout history and political theory have in common. So it's a big concept, but for that reason also kind of minimal. But I think it's important to sort of hash this out. So in the book, I argue that the border is the most basic definition of the border that I'm working with here is a division. Okay, so I mean, one could define borders in lots of different ways. Here, I'm starting with a very basic definition of a division. What all borders share in common following this definition is that they introduce a division or a bifurcation of some sort into the world. This definition has four important, already reflexively, the word definition, the fini comes from the Latin word define. So already in the word definition, we're already deploying a version of a border, but that's not exactly the types of borders I'm concerned with. Anyway, so this definition has four important consequences for a theory of the border. If we define it as division, that will be further developed throughout the whole book. So this first chapter elaborates each of these four consequences and outlines a methodology for their general application to the study of borders, or what is historically called limnology. So the first consequence. So there are four, I'll talk about three, and if you ask me in the Q&A, I'll tell you what the fourth one is, because we won't have time for that in the talk. So the border is in between. So that's the first consequence. If you define the border as division, then the border functions in between. So the first consequence is that it functions is that the border is not reducible to the classical definitions of the limits of a sovereign state, which is maybe what many of you are thinking of, or when we first think of borders, we think of states and we think of their sovereign limits and so on. And there's reason for that, because most early border theorists all basically just center their analysis only on the state. 18th century, late 18th century forward, it's all state borders, nothing else. So this is the case not only because the techniques of social division precede the development of states historically, but because even as, quote, a division between states, the border is not contained entirely within the states. The border is precisely between the states. Just as the cut made by a pair of scissors that divides a piece of paper is resolutely not part of the paper, so the border as a division is not entirely contained by the territory, state, law, or economy that divides it. So while the technologies of division themselves may differ throughout history according to who wields them, when, where, and so on, the cut or process of social division itself is what is common to all of these relative manifestations. So this is why there are different types of this same process. This is an important consequence for a theory of the border, since it means that the study of borders cannot be approached solely according to one type of division or social force, between territories, between states, like I said, the privilege has been on states, between juridical and economic regimes. So it's not reducible to any one of those. This is the case because what is common to all these types of borders is the status of the between that remains missing from each of the regimes of social power. What remains problematic about border theory is that it's not strictly a territorial, political, juridical, or economic phenomenon, but equally an aterritorial, apolitical, non-legal, and non-economic phenomena at the same time. Take, for example, the border between states. A border of a state has two sides. On one side, the border touches and is thus part of one state, and on the other side, the border touches and is thus part of the other state. But the border is not only its sides that touch the two states, it's also a third thing, the thing in between the two that touches the states. This is the fuzzy, zone-like phenomena of inclusive disjunction that many border theorists have identified as neither nor, both and. If the border were entirely reducible to two states, nothing would divide them, which can't be true. For example, if a piece of paper is cut down the middle, there remains something in between the two pieces of paper which is not paper and which divides the two pieces. Similarly, in between the two sides of the cut that touch each of the states is the division itself, which is not the state, nor part of the state. The states infinitely approach the limit in between them in the sense best described by the mathematical concept of a limit in calculus. States approach the limit of the border, right, but never reach it or totalize it. Once and for all, because the limit is a process that infinitely approaches the point of bifurcation, like the slope of a tangent. So not the tangent exactly, but the slope, the relationship between, like if you have a circle or a curve, the slope of the tangent as it intersects is sort of infinitely approachable. You can just keep on point blah, 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 blah forever. You can keep approaching it without ever reaching it. So border theory is a study of this limit, it's limology. But just because the cut of the border is not reducible to any given border regime of social force or power does not mean that it's in any way a negative process. The in-betweenness of the border is not a lack or an absence. The border is absolutely positive and a continuous process of multiplication by division. So by dividing, it actually multiplies. Not by dividing does it create binaries or negativities, but through division, it multiplies. The more it divides social space, the more it multiplies it. So for every division, you just simply multiply the spaces. Subdivisions multiply subspaces and so forth. Therefore, it's important to distinguish between two kinds of division, extensive and intensive. The first kind of division, extensive, introduces an absolute break, producing two quantitatively separate and discontinuous entities. Oh, awesome. Can I grab a marker?
Yeah.
Yeah, there should be.
And on the right. Yeah.
You guys are so organized.
It's not us.
That's true.
Is this, can I use this?
Yeah.
It's not gonna sting.
I don't think so.
I mean, this looks dangerous.
Not so much.
Dry erase.
Dry erase, okay. So it's not a division like this or something like that. Like you have some sort of line, some sort of movement, continuous process, division, there's some other process. So it's not that type, that's the extensive type. I mean, maybe that's what we have in mind when we think about these things. But it's not so it's not a matter, the division doesn't create two discontinuous entities. That's extensive. So the second kind of division is intensive. And this adds a new path to the existing one, like a fork or a bifurcation, producing a qualitative change of the whole continuous system. The bifurcation diverges from itself while still being the same pathway. So you have instead this model where you have a continuous line, let's say, and then you have from this same line, right, a bifurcation. So what you have is a division, right? So we can say these 2 points are divided in some way, but it's a division that is a bifurcation, and this point goes infinitely small, right? Infinitely approaching the point of bifurcation. So, I mean, there's lots to be said about this in the history of sort of sciences and mathematics, but the general idea is that this is a completely different model than this one, where you have just total break and discontinuity versus continuity of multiplication through bifurcation. Okay, so that's the sort of first divisions in betweenness. Although borders are typically understood according to the extensive definition, your side, my side, something like this is only a relative effect of the intensive kind of division. Borders emerge where there's a continuous process that reaches a bifurcation point. After this point, a qualitative divergence occurs, and the two distinct pathways can be identified. The result of this bifurcation is that the border is experienced as a continuity by some and as a discontinuity by others. So where some would say like, oh, I don't even notice the border, I just sort of drive through, right? And then other folks, they're like, actually the border is a very important thing for me and I have to deal with it on a daily basis and I face discrimination and passport issues and blah, 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 blah. So the border functions as both. And I think this model better accounts for that sort of continuity and discontinuity at the same time, as well as other things. So for affluent travelers, for example, a border may function as a relatively seamless continuity between two areas. For others, undocumented migrants, for instance, the border may appear as a discontinuous division across which way they are forbidden and from which they are redirected. In both cases, what remains primary is the continuous process that actively maintains the border and enforces it as a filter that allows one path or road to continue on ahead and another to be redirected elsewhere through detention, deportation, expulsion, etc. In other words, the border is an active process of bifurcation that does not simply divide once and for all, but continuously redirects flows of people and things across or away from itself. The border or social division in between territories, states, etc. only appears as lack or discontinuity from the binary perspective of the presupposed social bodies that are divided. Does that make sense? So from the perspective of the social body, which is we are primary, we make our own laws, et cetera, the condition of that social body in the first place is precisely the border that constructed and allowed it to call itself some unified social body. So it's a sort of retroactive attribution of their own self-generation when in fact the border was required for them in the first place. So from this perspective, the border appears conceptually as secondary or derivative. We make our borders. With respect to power of territorial, state, and juridical economic power, and so on. So they perceive it as sort of mentally or politically secondary when in fact it's actually the primary process. But the problem with this extensive definition of the border is that it presupposes precisely what it proposes to explain. If individual societies are defined as delimited territorial, political, juridical, or economic fields of power, and borders are the various divisions these societies create, how did these societies come to be delimited or bordered in the first place? In other words, a border seems to be something created not only by the societies that define them within and from one another, but also something that's required for the very existence of society itself as a delimited social field in the first place. In this sense, the border is both constitutive of and constituted by society. Society without any kind of border, internal or external, is simply what we would call the earth or world, some sort of pre-social undivided surface. Accordingly, society is first and foremost a product of the borders that define it, right? Only afterward are the borders reproduced by that society. So their reproduction act is as understood as supposedly a primary one when it is in fact secondary. This is another important consequence for the theory of the border as a continuous division of bifurcations. If we want to understand the border, we should start with the border, not with societies or states. A good bit of border theory starts with states and then tries to explain the border. My point is the reverse. We should start with the border if we want to understand the border. We should start with it first as a primary process instead of seeing it as a secondary derivative one. Same methodology was at work in the Migrant book in this inversion process. So the border is the social condition necessary for the emergence of societies, not the other way around. The product, as Marx says, must not be confused with the producer. But the border is not only in between the inside and outside of two territories, states, etc. It's also in between the inside and the inside itself. That sounds weird. It is the division within society, just to say it's not just the border that says here's society, here's Barbaron or whatever, like here's outside other folks, but also internal divisions. So this is one of the key consequences of the in-betweenness of borders that's been important for recent border studies. As Chris Rumford, this well-known border theorist guy, points out, quote, border studies now routinely address a wide range of complex what, where, and who questions. What constitutes a border when the emphasis is on the process of bordering, not borders as things? Where are the borders to be found? Who is doing the bordering? Is it still possible to ask these questions and receive a straightforward, predictable answer? The state. This is no longer a satisfactory answer. Seeing like a border involves the recognition that borders are woven into the fabric of society and are the routine business of all concerned. In this sense, borders are key to understanding networked connectivity as well as questions of identity, belonging, political conflict, and social transformation. End quote. Accordingly, recent border theory has become significantly multidisciplinary, as David Newman writes, another border theorist, geographer guy. Quote, for as long as the study of boundaries was synonymous with the line separating the sovereign territory of the states in the international system, the focus of research was geographical, hence where most border studies happens in geography departments. As our understanding of boundaries has taken on new forms and scales of analysis, so too the study of bordering phenomena has become multidisciplinary, with sociologists, political scientists, historians, international lawyers, and anthropologists taking an active part in the expanding discourse, end quote. However, as border theory has included new scales of analysis, so analyzing more and more things as border phenomena, it has also, according to Newman, quote, experienced difficulty in fusing into a single set of recognizable parameters and concepts. So what this book is aiming to do is to sort of propose a set of philosophical concepts that will allow us to theorize the border at a lot of different levels, not all of them, but many different levels of in-betweenness. Okay, so that's the first consequence. The second consequence, in-betweenness, the border is a process that happens in between, is not reducible to the things in which it divides. The second consequence is that border is in motion. And this is not the typical way that border theorists or geographers have tended to deal with the question of the border, not as motion, so this is one of the contributions that I'm trying to make here. So this process of social division is not static. So it's process and it's in motion. In part, this is a consequence of the fact that the border as a continuous division is in between and not reducible to any fixed side. So it relates to the first point, the first consequence. The practical consequences of this second point are that the border is a zone of contestation. The border is always made and remade according to a host of shifting variables. So it's not like we can say, it's very hard to say where the border is, even though that sounds like a simple question. It's actually quite complex to say where a border is taking place. Is it happening to you in the airport? Is it happening to you on the street? Is it happening at some geographical zone? Even in that geographical zone, like maybe it's not happening, even though there's supposed to be a border there, no one is there. US-Mexico wall, there's just like a huge gap where they call there's a virtual border, just like cameras. And then, it picks up wildlife and all kinds of weird stuff, but there's like no actual wall there. Anyway, so there's complications about where the walls are, where they're not, and where the border actually is, as well as just the actual shifting of it. Like US-Mexico border, they have to like fill in all these valleys because the wall is going like this up these mountainous valleys or whatever. So they're literally having to shift and move big sections of land and rivers in order, and then the border is constantly falling and they have to rebuild it and move it around. In any case, in this sense, the border should not be analyzed according to motion simply because people and objects move across it or because it's permeable. That's not the sense that I mean border. The border is not simply a static membrane or a space through which flows of people move. In contrast to the vast literature on the movement of people and things across borders, there's relatively little analysis of the motion of the border itself. A lot of theorists out there talk about people moving across borders, oh, it's a movement analysis. Yeah, but the border is always static. It's the permeable membrane that people move across. So this is a different point of analysis here. Even many so-called theorists of flows, fluidity, and mobility continue to describe the border in primarily extensive and spatial terms as, quote, borderscapes, shaped by global flows of people, end quote, or as, quote, the material form of support for flows. So not the flows themselves, mind you, but the support for them, end quote, whose mobility or fluidity is purely, and this is, his name's escaping me. Anyway, the globalization, wrote a book on globalization. So, no, okay. Anyway, he calls them, he just says metaphorical. It's all fluid, everything's flux and flow, everything solid melts into air, it's just metaphor. It's not actually about movement. So the movement of the border is not metaphor, is my point here. The border is literally and actually in motion in many ways. First, the border moves itself. This is especially apparent in the case of geomorphology, the movement of rivers, the shifting of sands and tides along coastlines, the emergence and destruction of ocean islands, volcanic transformations of mountain ranges, valleys, the redistribution of soil itself through erosion, deposition caused by wind and water, and even the vegetative shifting of tree lines, desertification, the climatic changes. This is a long list, but I swear the primary literature on this just goes on and on and on about natural borders in the 19th century. But there's lots, and these are not just natural phenomena. These have immediate political effects because they regulate and influence the political space, the political body, and where it's limited. So the border also moves itself in not so obvious ways, like the constant state of erosion, decay, decomposition to which every physical object on Earth is subject to. This includes the crumbling of mortar that holds walls together, the rains and floods that rot wooden fences, the fires that burn down buildings and towers, the rust that eats through holes, through the fences and gates, the erosion that removes dirt from underneath a building, and so on. Every physical border is subject to a movement of constant self-decomposition. Secondly, the border is moved by others. This is especially apparent in the case of territorial conflicts, where two or more social parties negotiate or struggle over land divisions. Political and military conflicts over control over people, land, and resources, juridical repartitions of the legal domains of police municipalities, the economic reforms that directly change trade barriers, tariffs, and labor restrictions and production zones. These are constantly being shifted, especially juridical and other political zones. Borders with large zone-like areas may persist as sites of continual negotiation and movement. We could think they're probably about US-Mexico border wall, or we could think about Israel-Palestine. There's these sort of zones where it's not clear what space this is. It's an occupied territory or something, right? Whose zone is it actually? So who has political control over it? You get the idea. In a more restricted sense, this is the process that Jacques Ancel, one of the original sort of geographers of borders, describes as frontières plastiques, so the sort of plastic or movable, malleable borders in equilibrium between social forces. So the social forces are in contestation, so are the actual borders. But the border's also moved in not so obvious ways, like the continual process of management required to maintain the border. Without regular intervention and reproduction, I mean, this is just a very kind of materialist, maybe even just generally, materialist or Marxist point, like someone's got to work at the border and keep maintaining it. Without regular intervention and reproduction, or even legal or economic deployments, borders decay, they're forgotten, taken over by others, weakened, etc. Borders are neither static nor given, but reproduced. So it requires active reproduction to maintain the border, so it's not static. If guards abandon their post, is the border still there? If people are just flowing by and there's no one there, is there actually a border? Or what kind of border? So as Nick Vaughan Williams writes, quote, none of these borders is in any sense given, but reproduced through modes of affirmation and contestation, and is, above all, lived. In other words, borders are not natural, neutral, or static, but historically contingent, politically charged, dynamic phenomena that first and foremost involve people and their everyday lives, end quote. So the common mental image many people have of borders as static walls is neither conceptually nor practically accurate. If anything, borders are more like motors, the mobile cutting blades of a society. Just like any other border technologies must be maintained, reproduced, refueled, defended, started up, paid for, repaired, and so on. Even ethnic, religious, or national borders have their technologies. The control over who is allowed in, what cafe, in what church, in what school, etc. The border is literally a limit in motion, as some scholars have concretely demonstrated. Furthermore, this is not a new phenomenon that applies only or largely to contemporary life. Borders, as I hope to show throughout the book, because there's a good bit of it's historical, have always been mobile and multiple. This is another thing in border studies. People say like, oh, we're in a global era of globalization, borders have become X, Y, and Z. Well, my argument is they've always been mobile, they've always been fluid, they've always had these characteristics to them. There is something unique about contemporary life, but it's not that. Management, in some form or another, has always been part of their existence. They always require this reproductive activity. They're always physically, literally in motion, not metaphorically. Therefore, the distinction between natural and artificial borders posed by early border theorists cannot be maintained. This is the case not only because today borders are radically different than they used to be, but because throughout history, natural borders, as borders, were always delimited, disputed, and maintained by artificial human societies that declared those mountains, this river. I mean, there's no like pure natural border or something like that. So that bridges are built, taxed, and so on. Socially disputed or accepted divisions are negotiated. Additionally, so-called artificial borders always function by cutting or dividing some natural flow of the earth, or people who are themselves natural beings. In any case, the whole artificial natural thing is not a route I want to go on. Okay, so that's the end of the second section. The third consequence is the border is a form of circulation. So it's in between, it's movable, mobile, and it's a form of circulation. And maybe that sounds obvious or not, but in the border literature, I promise that's not at all obvious, that's how borders are being analyzed. So the third major consequence of a border theory defined by the social process of division is that the border can't be properly understood in terms of inclusion and exclusion. There's a lot of literature out there, especially after Giorgio Agamben, talking about inclusion and exclusion, and I just don't think that those are terms that make sense to do border analysis with. Not saying that there isn't some sense in which something is excluded or included, but that's a secondary determination of what is in fact the primary process of movement and circulation. So, in part, this follows from the movement of the border. Since the border is always in between and in motion, it's continually changing, a continually changing process. Borders are never done including someone or something. This is the case not only because empirically borders are at the outskirts of a society and within it, insofar as there's some kind of border apparatus that functions there at the limit, but because borders regularly change their selection process of inclusion, such that anyone might be expelled at any moment. In particular, after 9/11, this is like, maybe we're all more keenly aware of this in the Patriot Act and so on, that people can just be removed, even American citizens just removed or even killed, without proper juridical process. Furthermore, the process of circulation and recirculation performed by borders is not under the sole control of anyone like a sovereign. The power of the border is to allow in and out. The power to allow in and out is profoundly overdetermined by a host of other social forces, in addition to something like sovereign or executive state power or something like that. You also have like the daily management of the border technology, the motor, the social acceptance or refusal of the border, the drivers who are at the border vehicle, the subjective whims of those who enforce the borders to accept bribes or not, and so on. The techniques of border circulation only have the strength society gives them. My point is, whatever the law says, even though like, what is it, SB, whatever the big border 2006 law that was passed in the US, it's a very short bill that basically says the wall, US-Mexico border wall is meant to keep out every single like alien. Just like, okay, is that, I mean, like that can't possibly be attainable or even desirable really. But the idea is that it like, regardless of what the sovereign declares, there is a reality of what actually happens in all the micro practices at the border. So in practice, borders, both internal and external, have never even succeeded in keeping anyone out. Given the constant failure of the border in this regard, the binary and abstract categories of inclusion and exclusion, I think have almost no explanatory power. The failure, supposedly, right, to keep in or to keep out of borders to include or exclude is not just a contemporary waning of sovereignty. Wendy Brown has argued that. Of postmodern nation states. Borders have always leaked. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not indicative of some special contemporary moment. Borders have never succeeded in keeping people out or keeping people in. So to talk about as a failure is like, that's too high of a standard to be setting. So the so-called greatest examples of historical wall power, Hadrian's Wall or the Great Wall of China, they weren't even built intentionally. A lot of recent research of archaeologists has shown were not meant to keep people out or even to stop opposing armies. Rather, their most successful and intended historically consequence or function was the social circulation of labor and customs. The walls were not built to keep people out, no matter how imposing and grandiose they look. It was not to block anything. It was actually to control the circulations of customs and the movements of people. So today, this remains unchanged with the US-Mexico border wall. I could give 100 examples. You can ask me in the Q&A of how the US-Mexico border wall does this form of circulation. So borders have types and functions, but none of them keep in or out, absolutely. In fact, one of the main effects of borders is precisely their capacity to produce hybrid transition zones. A lot of border people talk about transition zones that are sort of dynamic. It's never clear whether you're in or out. Thus, quote, in the process of bordering, as David Newman writes, rather the borderline per se has, that has universal significance. It is the process of bordering rather than the border line. So if you imagine the border just sort of shift, it's not a line, it's a process. And as a process, that's what all of these borders sort of have in common. Last paragraph of the section. But so border circulation is not only an ongoing process of dividing, its technologies of division also have a direct effect on what is divided. What is divided must be recirculated, defended, maintained, and even expanded. But at the same time, what is divided must also be expelled and pushed away. So division is not blockage, it's redirection. So it's a question of bifurcation and their redirections, like how are the flows of humans being recirculated, or the flows of animals, or other sorts of flows of material flows, how are they being redistributed, recirculated, and to what end and what goal? That's all part of what the border does. It's not just simply about does it block stuff or not. What is circulated does not stop after the division, it comes back again. That's why their circulation is always a recirculation, because the flows return back. Just because you block one temporarily doesn't mean it doesn't return again in another form, in another way, or in the exact same way, but doesn't get through on the second or third time. So the border does not logically decide. It practically redistributes. Since the border is never done once and for all with its divisions, some people who are expelled come back again from inside, undocumented workers, and others from the outside, border crossers. But since the border is not a logical binary or sovereign cut, its processes often break down, function partially, multiply, or relocate the division altogether. Instead of dividing into two, according to the static logic of sovereign binarism, the border divides by movement and multiplication. The border adds to the first division another one and another, and so on, moving further along. Instead of, quote, the sovereign who decides on the exception, as Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben write, we should say instead that it is, quote, the border that recirculates the division. And now I have to skip the fourth consequence. It's short, but you can ask me about it. So now this is maybe the more sort of philosophy part of it. So this is the final section on method. So this is the methodology used to sort of develop, like philosophically frame the rest of the analysis of the book through what I call transcendental, I don't know if it sounds goofy or not, you'll have to tell me in the Q&A quite honestly, transcendental limnology. So it's in the transcendental tradition, philosophically, and limnology, it's just such a cool word that all the border people use. So that's the method, it's sort of a transcendental analysis of borders. So these 4 consequences for thinking the border as a process of division are crucial. Methodologically, however, the multiplication of levels of border analysis continue to pose a serious challenge for any theory of the border. As Corey Johnson and Rhys Jones, geography border people, write, quote, the expansive understanding of borders and boundaries in recent scholarship has enriched border studies, but it's also obscured what a border is, end quote. If Etienne Balibar writes, quote, borders are everywhere, end quote, then they are nowhere. This is the current crisis of border theory. One of the motivations for writing this book is that everybody's celebrating the multiplication of all these discourses. Oh, this is a border, that's a border, everything's a border. And then at that point you're like, everything is a border, huh? And then we just sort of lost the border because now we're just doing metaphysics. And because we're just asking very general questions like, oh, the border between right and wrong, and the border between genres of comedy and fiction and sadness, you know, like, and tragedy and so on. We're not, I mean, it's very far from what many of these geography border people would tie back to their own tradition. That said, this is kind of a crisis, and I give you that example of Balibar opens his essay called What is a Border? And he's like, oh, the word definition is already a border. And then he's like, oh, so we already can't even answer this question because even the definition itself presupposes the thing that we're trying to describe. I kind of want to just sidestep that and say, like, maybe, whatever, I'm not doing that. I want to try to narrow that down and not be doing some grand because I think that's where border theory is right now at, which is now it kind of just sounds like we're doing like some kind of engaged metaphysics where we're asking about all kinds of borders and they're everywhere. So another border theorist here, thus Alexson writes, quote, we should be careful not to call everything a border, end quote, lest we risk, quote, the potential loss of analytical clarity if the border concept is used too broadly, end quote. Okay, that was very nicely said, better than I did. But you get the idea. Therefore, a significant methodological problem for our theory of the border is how to create a concept of the border which would make sense of multiple different kinds of borders, not just geographical ones. That's what I think. And maybe not all of them, but like we have to start doing something there, or else it's just this border theory remains this kind of messy zone. As David Newman writes, quote, what is sorely lacking in it is a solid theoretical base that will allow us to understand the boundary phenomena as it takes place within different social and spatial dimensions. A theory which would enable us to understand the process of bounding and bordering rather than simply the compartmentalized outcome of the various social and political processes, end quote. Most of these quotes, by the way, this is all like recent geographers, musing over the crisis of their study, and this is like just like 2 years ago. Most of these quotes are all very recent. In other words, what's required, according to Newman, is a theory of the border as a primary process and not as a derivative social product. However, not everyone agrees that such a, quote, solid theoretical basis is attainable, much less desirable. As Ansi Passy writes, quote, a general border theory seems unattainable and even undesirable for 2 reasons. First, individual state borders are historically contingent and characterized by contextual features and power relations. There can hardly be one grand theory that would be valid for all borders. Such a theory is not problematic because the borders are unique, but rather because of the complexity of borders and bordering, end quote. Truly, each and every border in history is empirically unique and composed of a complex mixture of different types of power. Perhaps the explosion of a new border theories in the last 10 years has not given rise to a catch-all theory, as Passy says, precisely because such a theory would have to be void of any empirical content specific to each border, and in doing so would render itself inapplicable everywhere. On the other hand, perhaps the recent desire for such a theory of the border has emerged precisely because of a growing frustration that the singular empirical study of specific borders lacks any larger implications, concepts, or frameworks outside of its own parochial study. So you get lots of geographers and border people doing very close analysis, like this little tiny border in southern Africa is very important for these very local reasons, and it's like it's not clear how that connects with all types of borders everywhere, or that there's a theory, or if it does have any relationship anywhere to anything else. Yes, so they all have their own specific history. On the other hand, perhaps I just read that. Without a transferable concept or framework of some kind, the empirical study of borders in all their historical uniqueness, begins anew with each analysis, with no consequences for the future studies or other disciplines outside geography. Mostly it happens geography. For example, according to this empiricism, those trying to understand the division of territory between the US and Mexico are talking about the division of territory US-Mexico are talking about a completely different border than those trying to understand the juridical borders of immigration enforcement inside the US. However, the idea that immigration enforcement, juridical borders, and border patrol, territorial borders, have absolutely nothing in common seems absurd. We would want to somehow unite these things, like what the border does at the geographical border. That seems to have some resemblance to the borders that happen inside the country as well, especially after their political unification under the Department of Homeland Security. So the debate between grand theory versus scientific empiricism raised in the last few years in border theory is not a new one in philosophy. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant formulated a similar polemic in the Critique of Pure Reason between metaphysics and empiricism. On the one hand, metaphysics, Kant says, quote, is a speculative cognition by reason that is wholly isolated and rises entirely above being instructed by experience, end quote. In other words, the knowledge of what the world is like in itself cannot have any foundation in our experience. Thus, no application, no verification. On the other hand, empiricism has, quote, assumed that all of our cognition must conform to objects. On that presupposition, however, all of our attempts to establish something about them a priori, by means of concepts through which our cognition would be expanded, have come to nothing, end quote. So obviously Kant's on neither team there. In other words, the empirical sciences bombard us with specific information but tell us absolutely nothing about more general a priori conditions of knowledge under which that information appears as such. Thus, Kant's solution to this problem is to invert it, just as Copernicus did. Let us assume instead, Kant says, quote, that objects must conform to our cognition, end quote, in the same way that the spectator revolves and the stars remain at rest, end quote, for Copernicus. In other words, Kant proposes instead to identify the rules, quote, that I must presuppose within me even before objects are given to me, and hence must presuppose a priori. And that rule is expressed in a priori concepts. Hence, all objects of experience must necessarily conform to these concepts and agree with them. So here you get the transcendental logic and the transcendental aesthetic, end quote. So Kant names this philosophical inquiry into the conditions of possible experience transcendental idealism. In this way, he avoids both the problems of grand theory, metaphysics, and scientific empiricism. However, more contemporary developments in transcendental philosophy remain much more useful for developing a theory of the border, I think. Neither of the grand theory or empirical variety. For example, later in the 20th century, French philosopher Michel Foucault takes up Kant's transcendental insight, but modifies it according to Friedrich Nietzsche's historical critique of Kant's idealism. In short, Kant's a priori remains for Nietzsche ahistorical and fails to consider the ways in which the transcendental categories of experience are themselves produced over thousands of years of human social development, what Nietzsche calls mnemotechnics, the construction of consciousness through physical and social violence. Following Nietzsche, Foucault's contribution to transcendental philosophy is to show that there are what he calls historical a priori, conditions that are more primary and constitutive of knowledge and consciousness. These conditions are both transcendental in the sense that they are conditions, but they are also empirical in the sense in which they are real, historical, and even contingent conditions for knowledge, experience, and so on. Other precursors to this concept are Jean Hippolyte's concept of, quote, a subjectless transcendental field, or Sartre's idea of a pre-subjective transcendental field. So these are all kind of non-idealist transcendental fields. All around the same time, French philosopher Gilles Deleuze follows a similar trajectory by the name of transcendental empiricism. Kant's mistake, Deleuze argues, was to have induced his transcendental categories as they, quote, appear under the determination of common sense, end quote. For Deleuze, however, a transcendental idea does not come from an inner common sense, but rather from a violent and political force from outside that forces one to think or act. So it's fundamentally social and outside of the subject. The transcendental for Deleuze is thus deeply contingent and empirically constituted. It is a transcendentalism of the real conditions, not the possible conditions. More recently, Alain Badiou has followed the same legacy under the name of transcendental materialism. For Badiou, the world is made up of material bodies and languages, but also of events that precede the formation of subjects and thus sort of condition its empirical existence. Following this general transcendental insight that I've kind of laid out historically here, I'd like to propose my own methodology for border studies. What I'm proposing is neither the grand theory of metaphysics, of the border in itself, like everything is a border, the table is the border between this side and that side of the computer or whatever. Not the metaphysical tradition that would attempt to explain all borders in advance and thus render empirical studies useless. I think that in metaphysics of the border, I think a lot of border studies people would be like, oh, how does this make sense of like borders, all these politically charged borders? You're just telling me what it is in general, and that doesn't give me any politics or history, doesn't inform my analysis, nor purely empirical science, one, because I'm not qualified to do that kind of empirical work, of the border those proposed early geographers, Jacques Ancel, Richard Hartshorne, and a whole bunch of other folks. The goal for a theory of the border developed in this book is to develop, as David Newman puts it, quote, a solid theoretical base that will allow us to understand the boundary phenomena as it takes place within different social and spatial dimensions. Again, I can't account for every single kind of border, but the specifically social dimensions of the border. To be clear, this book does not develop a theory of all kinds of borders across every single different dimension of reality. Such a project would be more akin to ontology of the border and would have to explain every type of border, including the border between genres, sickness and health, the border between knowledge and ignorance, and even between things in general. Arguably, metaphysicians have been doing this for quite some time. Instead, the goal of this book is to provide a solid theoretical base of analytical clarity across four major social and specifically material types of borders: territorial, political, juridical, and economic. Those are the four major types of borders, and there's lots of little sort of subtypes and so on. Accordingly, this book limits its analysis to four major types of material border technologies. So they're broader than you think, but I'm just going to list them. The fence, the wall, the cell, and the checkpoint. So those are four major types of border. You can't be thinking of some specific fence, because what the fence is has to also be sort of reconceived, and there's different types of fencing and different types of walls and cells and so on. So this book is not a theory of metaphorical or metaphysical borders, it's a theory of the material social technologies that produce social division. So I'm actually looking at material technologies. And material here in a broad sense, but yes, that's still to be worked out a bit. But a border is not simply an empirical technology. It's also a regime, in the sense that Foucault will talk about a regime of knowledge or something like that, or a, quote, set of relations that organize empirical border technologies. So what I'm calling a border regime is precisely, it's the transcendental, it's the material conditions under which the border can appear. So we're not just looking at specific borders, although there are obviously empirical borders that need to be looked at, but this is a generalized regime or set of relations that allow that border to make sense in a larger network. So the border regime does not transcend the material technologies that constitute it. It's not like an idea that humans impose upon reality or something. It is their condition, not their cause. And it changes according to the way in which the material border technologies are assembled. Thus, the method of this study is materialist in the sense in which it understands borders as social regimes of concrete practices, not primarily ideas or knowledges that emerged independently from the social material conditions. If anything, much of the work would show that certain ideas of rationality and truth and so on actually were the conditions of philosophers or other scientists sitting around and even having those discussions, is precisely the material technologies of bordering that allowed for them to have something like the scientific revolution or something like that. I don't go that far, but I'm just saying, giving examples here. So the theory of the border, last paragraph. The theory of, thanks. The theory of this border, this book provides follows roughly in the post-Kantian tradition. So I'm calling it post-Kantian because it comes out of this transcendental legacy. Just as there are real transcendental conditions, according to Deleuze, they're not possible, right? They're not mental or ideal. According to Deleuze, Foucault, and Badiou, for the emergence of consciousness, knowledge, and so on. So Nietzsche wants to explain the emergence of consciousness through historical material forces. I want to do the same thing, but specifically around these border regimes. So the transcendental regimes, the conditions under which certain borders appear. That are profoundly social and historical, so there are real transcendental conditions for the emergence of empirical borders. In other words, there's not one universal set of a priori concepts that will explain the existence of every and all borders. So I don't even know if the metaphysical project is possible, much less desirable there. There are, however, several different transcendental logics or regimes according to which most, perhaps not all, social borders operate. These logics are not transcendentally idealist in the Kantian sense of how they appear to consciousness, but neither are they purely empirical insofar as they're not simply things or objects in the world. They are transcendentally empirical, historical, or material in the sense in which they describe how several groups of empirical border technologies are related and function as methods of social movement and division. Thus, we might call this method transcendental limnology, or the theory of the real conditions for the production of social borders. Thank you. Sorry, dropped in.
Okay, I'm writing that last thought down and then I'll start fielding questions. But to start thinking of questions, we have time for Wait, will you say the last line one more time?
We might consider this a transcendental limnology, or the theory of the real conditions for the production of social borders.
Okay, so please.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. The first one is just concerning, just basically about agency. So, like, in other words, I'm thinking of actor network theory and the possibility of there being a kind of non-human agency to the border.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you what you thought of that. And then also, of course, one of the reasons why I wanted to come here is because I've been told that you're the Deleuze expert. And so and so of course the first thing that sort of comes to my mind when thinking about Deleuze and the border is not only minority issues, which you say that it seems that you're not really dealing with, but also territorialization and re-territorialization. And so just basically the question with the Deleuze would be to try to see how you would connect his concept of territorialization, et cetera, with your idea of the border, and maybe you'll do that in the book, so it doesn't have to be as extensive. I don't know.
Okay, so I'll do my best to answer that, because it's a big question and it takes me like hundreds of pages to answer it. So let me
you
just,
do talk about it in the book,
oh,
is what you're
completely.
saying? Okay.
Yeah, completely. I mean, this book is not about Deleuze. I mean, I am very much inspired by Deleuze. I mean, the logic of territorialization, deterritorialization, re-territorialization, I like that in principle. I think that's a cool idea because it emphasizes the process as primary, because they always say like everything's constantly undergoing them. So it's not like you ever have a fixed anything, but they're always processes of, there's the gerund or something at the end, it's a process of territorialization or something like that. So they emphasize that continual changing, and I would say I share a general theoretical affinity on that point with Deleuze.
So the way that the different processes are moving about determine the border.
Exactly. So putting the process first is like that tradition of that philosophical tradition, maybe most recently with Deleuze or Michel Serres or something, but going far back into the tradition to like Lucretius and the atomists, philosophers emphasizing process as primary as opposed to the product. And I think Marx certainly would be in that camp too. But that's the general project, is just emphasizing process in border theory, which I don't think has been sufficiently done. One kind of maybe beef with Deleuze on this particular point, which is that I think territorialization, while it's a good logic, I would want to add, like, I think that there's that territorial borders are only one type. So territorialization, I mean, of course they mean territory in a very, like there's like psychic territories and sonic territories, and there's all these, so I think they even mean it in a broader sense also. So maybe my disagreement is not real, but it may be dependent. And on the question of subjects and minorities, so that's not the subject of this work, but that was the subject of the previous one. Yeah. So that one's all about the migrant, and so that goes through historically under similar transcendental regimes of power and force, shows the figures who are associated with movement under these different types of power. So the migrant is not just like one figure, but there's a whole typology of different migrants. They've just gone under different names historically. Barbarians, nomads, and on Deleuze, I like his work on the nomads. So barbarians, vagabonds, and then maybe broadly construed the proletariat. Although more specifically, it's lumpen, dirty, rag-picking kind of the lumpen proletariat. But yeah, good question. Thanks.
That was great.
Thanks.
There was a lot of what you were saying was focusing on the actual geographical border. I mean, obviously, the line drawn on a map doesn't cut it, but that you were coming back to the actual border that does have a sort of geographical location. But I thought I was hearing something else, and I wasn't quite sure, because it seemed as though there was something else beyond that, which was that the border sort of permeated everything within the territory as well. And I was wondering if I was getting that right, or if you meant that, or if you could say a little more about that.
Yeah.
And I had to be thinking of that. Well, Hegel makes this distinction between a qualitative border and a quantitative border, and that both of them to do with what is not being in what is. But the qualitative border runs through the whole thing. And I was wondering is anything like that going on?
I haven't read those sections. Is that in the logic?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are some
it's about
sections that I
determining-
know I'm aware of in the logic
Yeah.
that I haven't read yet. I'm a little hesitant because it's like it's like metaphysics of
Well, it
borders.
is.
For Hegel, this is a metaphysical question of what
all
border is.
limit. I mean, he's doing all limit. So
Yeah.
so you maybe should.
Yeah, but
stay
it's sort of
away
all
from
and
it.
none.
Yeah.
That's the thing that
Right.
that's why I would have to say on this point, like I would want to start with material history,
Yeah.
as a good Marxist, Foucauldian, Deleuzian, whatever, and not with ideal metaphysical forms of
Yeah.
like what is a limit in general.
Yeah, right.
Although that's not to say I couldn't learn something from the metaphysical discussion.
But I only brought that in because I think you're right. I mean, that I don't know that that's going to help at all. But it was just more the thing of the border permeating
Yes.
the whole territory. And,
Yeah,
and
so-
every movement of every individual, wherever you are geographically. I mean, right in the middle of the territory somehow.
I know
Was
my
that what
examples
you
in the
were saying?
beginning
Yeah.
are like meant for maybe clarity, but you're right. I like focus too much on actual geographical limits of states and so on in my examples. Anyway, that's not the privilege of the book for certain, but it's if I said any more, I would have to explain why that was a border, because you'd be like, is that a border? So I'll just give you some examples, although I can't, I mean, it fills up the book, but I'll give you some examples of interior things. So when I mentioned the cell, in particular the cell and the checkpoint, I think are two types of borders that emerge that are absolutely suffuse, especially with the checkpoint, because the modern checkpoint emerging, my argument is roughly around 18th century forward, with the rise of the police force, surveillance, informational technologies, passports. With the emergence of all that stuff historically, the border just starts to appear like at any point whatever. And so like you can't even, like where's the material technology? Well, it's in the policeman, right? It's actually somebody, or it's in even the citizen who can report their fellow citizen for being out of status. Like that's where the border happens. So I mean that's like just one example, but I think historically this is suffuse also. I would just say like back to, I mean the history goes back somewhat far, but even I would say like Neolithic structures. I mean the whole megalith system is based on it's about social division, and it's absolutely interior to many villages. It's at the core and center. In fact, the foundations, as we know, Lewis Mumford, like the first city is the city of the dead. My argument here is that the first borders are actually the borders of the dead. But anyway, that's the like where the first graves were and the markings of the graves set up a limit, like a material social limit between life and death, between ancestors and not, between who's included in that community. Are you related to the ancestor? Are you not? Then you're allowed in the circle, or you're not. Something like that. They used to bury the dead bodies around these megaliths in this big sort of circle. You could cross over the threshold when your ancestors were in that pit. So that's a form of social division, which is not like very much pre-state. But there's like a bunch of these different divisions, but I think my emphasis would be that they're all kind of material, historical, and that any ideas are going to actually emerge as sort of predicated on these material historical divisions, which are have to be presupposed. Thanks, though.
To continue on the Hegelian theme, I was just thinking, I wanted to ask you about Homeland, and I wanted to ask you about the constitution of the private, and whether the public-private divisions somehow at play here, like the constitution of a border as being the constitution of a public, which is necessary for the constitution of the private. And so there's that. But then you were just bringing up the War of the Dead, and it made me think of Antigone, which Hegel uses as like the first clash of law, as being the clash between the public and the private law, the law of the family, which is the law of the dead. So I don't know if that's relevant, but I thought I would throw it out there. And I do want to say that everyone should read Hegel's Logic. Even if it's not necessary for this book project.
Yeah, I have to agree with you.
So, but in general, my question is, and it's just such a general question, is, because I don't know how it fits in here, like the Constitution of Public and Private, but actually through these material practices, and I'm also thinking of, you were talking about the police, we have the Constitution, you said Homeland Security, or Department of Homeland Security, we have the Homeland now. This is a new concept. And it appears at the same time that you have the Patriot Act, which is, in a sense, transcending of traditional juridical boundaries of the private and the public. And so you have this militarization of public space and then this erosion of the border between the private and public. So I don't know how that fits, but if you have any thoughts about the constitution of this idea of the homeland, and if private-public distinctions at all figure into your analysis of these four divisions or boundary phenomena, as you call them, the political, territorial, economic, juridical.
Okay, so there are two questions there. One is about the idea of the homeland.
Yeah.
And the second one about, what's the second one again?
The public-private.
Public-private. Okay,
Is that even?
So they're totally relevant. I mean, so
Yeah.
the contemporary stuff, one of the reasons for making this a kind of historical project to trace out the emergence when these border regimes first emerged. And I would say the concept of the homeland, if we want to tie it specifically to homeland security, that's a very contemporary thing. But if we want to talk about the concept of the homeland in general, I'd say it's a very, very old idea. And that it has several different historical incarnations that we could look at. If we want to talk about the contemporary context, I would say that is a huge tangled web, and one of the ways of untangling this web, because this is one of the things that happens in border studies, people look at a contemporary border, and then and then just start doing an analysis. And my question is actually most of the border technology that we have today have all emerged historically. There's not, for as much novelty as people want to ascribe to certain technologies, the general regime of power has been the same, or has been recycled through different social, political periods. And the idea of the homeland would be we could just trace that all the way through, almost origins of civilization, really.
Can I interrupt just a sec?
Yeah.
Just because I would love to hear if you think that there are contemporary material practices that have changed together with this concept of the homeland in the U.S., because we don't have it in the U.S. history as a prominent concept, and it's very controversial and people are debating it now. And it seemed to coincide with different practices, and so that was the question more that I was wondering if you have any sense.
See, this is why I wanted to write that last chapter
Yeah,
first,
sorry,
because
sorry.
but the contemporary issues, any contemporary bordering network, I would say, is a mixture. It's a mixture of territorial and I don't think you could think about the homeland and the U.S. sense of the invention of this idea of homeland. For us, what that means, you have to think about territorial divisions, political divisions, juridical divisions, and economic divisions. And each of those has its own kind of logic and draws on a rich history which has preceded it. Even if it's a new idea for America and we bring it to bear in a new way, a lot of the I guess the ways in which those technologies work are very old. I want to give you an example, but usually these analyses are quite complicated because I have to go through 4 different types of regimes and their examples. But I will say that we could just, if we stick with the Homeland Security and U.S.-Mexico border wall, in many ways this is very much a political type of division given over by executive order, some very high authority, the government. This is a state-sponsored, funded, contractors and so on. So it's a very state-centered project with very high political rhetoric about insides and outsides and aliens and who belongs and so on. That's at one level. There's a whole bunch of techniques that sovereign bordering, how sovereign functions. In particular, build a giant wall, try to keep everybody out. This never works, but it has never stopped the history of state power from building giant walls that didn't work. That said, they have other effects aside from not working. But one of them would be juridical. So there's a whole set of laws which involve both people on the other side of the wall as well as people on the inside of the wall and their relationship to the wall, and it's highly coded, and so there's a whole network of juridical laws that serve to sort of subdivide into a lot of other types of divisions, in particular cells. There's a whole cellular division apparatus, so detention centers, deportation camps, prison system, that's a new technique of bordering which is directly related to the wall border. like the geographical state enforced border requires all of the cellular divisions of individuals in cells, inside prison, detention centers. I'm going to stop because the analysis goes on, but my answer is yes, I do think that I think we could analyze the invention of a kind of contemporary American homeland, but we'd have to look at each of these types of regimes. Because during the Neolithic period, I really think there's mostly one clear dominant regime happening, and that's fencing in general. Like it's a centripetal, that the regime is centripetal force. The goal is to sort of bring in, build pots, create these huge, basically corral systems that bring all the animals in. It's about storing things and creating a kind of megalith central thing, bringing it all in. That's mostly what's going on there. Today, we've got a fair bit of that, but then we've got a lot of other stuff. I'm sorry, this is like a rambling. I'm not able to answer the question because it requires more of an analysis that I can give in a short
It
period of
wasn't a
time.
great question.
But the Antigone one, I'll have to say that is I think that's that was about private and public. So I think that particular distinction between private and public, that's also a historical one. And I think Antigone is like ancient Greece is a reference point for sure in the invention of public-private division. I think that's it's absolutely a historical invention, and we can look at all, and so like that's actually one chapter I have written out that's really interesting, is all the different bordering technologies required to produce a public. And there's a lot of them, and a lot of subtypes. And that's all I can say right now without going into all of the various subtypes. But city walls would be an obvious one. That is an absolutely new invention that emerges with civilizations, is walling your city in. And with the walled city, you get a lot of other things, but they all happen around the same time. So I would say, yeah, the invention of the public, you don't get a public or a private unless you get walls, city walls in particular, and ancient forms of walling in general. Okay, sorry that was such a long-winded.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could ask you to maybe clarify something or kind of just help my understanding on something you mentioned earlier, most with the diagram you're drawing, but kind of hopefully connect that to things you were saying later. So if we take the bottom drawing you did, where it kind of you have this sort of separation between, say if we take the example of territorial borders, like between states. So you have the edge of one state and the edge of the other, and then like sort of in between you have this sort of just like nothing space that kind of touches each but is neither state nor border. And so in that sense, like, is it that sort of immaterial concept of the border that kind of exists in that sort of space of nothing that is then sort of transferred and like sort of internalized in different people and sort of manifest as as you're describing technologies of the border, and like in sort of even personal like internalizations and like say in terms of the psyche of like a Mexican American like migrant or the child of a Mexican American or something like that, and just sort of like that the way it is that sort of space itself, it is that immaterial concept that becomes internalized and like sort of transferred and spread across geography and spaces that is then articulated in these material meanings. So is that
Yeah, I would agree with all of that except maybe the immaterial part, because I still think
Right.
consciousness is a material process, and I do think that so yes, but they have to do with that zone, and it's not a zone of nothing, which is just another minor thing I would say, was just it's not a negative space. It's positive, and it's actually primary. Society, so this is one of the in Foucault's lectures, but also society. The argument is that society is first war. Hobbes, Clausewitz, whatever. Like then you have society is primarily violence, antagonism, war, material conflict, and so on. And I would say I think that's about right. And then later on, we sort of have this thing like written culture, philosophy, and so on. And then we think to ourselves, oh, but didn't a god create it all? Didn't a god? It wasn't the god that. I mean, the Greek story is actually a really great one. The autochthonous myth of the Greeks is pretty incredible. We birthed ourselves. We just popped out of the earth. Well, it's more complicated than that. It involves some gods and some quasi-rape scenarios. But basically what happens is that the Greeks emerge just out of the earth. And they're like, yeah, we were just born out of it, so this is our land. You know that's not how that land was constituted. No doubt it was gained by somebody probably previously occupied it. That occupation had to be sustained. The use of all kinds of city walls was required to squeeze out the newly invented barbarian group of people. So really conflict and material antagonism, social conflict, and the process of establishing borders is first. Then, once ancient Greece is established, then we have our myth. But we just popped out of nowhere, out of the earth itself. We've always been here, it's ours. I mean, you see what I'm saying? So it's a kind of
So, yeah,
retroactive
so-
attribution of that story. So these the zone, it's not immaterial, it's not nothing, it's actually primary. What looks to be the primary states, those are actually secondary phenomena that emerge as results from the bordering antagonisms. And you still see that when you go to any border situation. You can see that it's not there's not a clean break. Even in some of the cleanest situations, there's not a clean division between inside and outside, and we could point to all kinds of differences and exceptions.
So in a sense, then it's not the concept itself, that sort of zone that you were talking about. Basically, it sort of necessarily existed before the border itself was drawn.
Yeah.
in a sense.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You just imagine that zone, but like everywhere, and then it's only through conflict and social organization and so on that these zones start to concretize into these crystallized forms that then we invent these sort of philosophical narratives about, you know, how God created us, or we popped out of our own mind, or we just popped out of the earth. I mean, all of the conditions of all of that was, you know, violence and social antagonism and social cooperation as well. But
I'm gonna insert myself into the question
Please
too,
do.
and then I saw your hand. Because the whole time you were talking, I kept thinking of placentas.
yes.
And as you were just talking, I was again thinking
Perfect
placentas,
segue. Yeah.
right? Things popping out of the earth,
Oh,
nowhere,
yeah.
that kind of stuff. But also that it all began in antagonism. But I was thinking, part of the reason I was thinking of placenta is like this in between, the border is in motion, the border is a form of circulation. I don't know what your fourth point was, but I hope it really does apply. Placenta's like where you're like,
I'm not sure, actually.
the first example you would think of is placenta. Okay. So I get that this is not your analysis, but even cell, right? The cell.
Yeah.
There's so many ways. So have you thought about placentas? A. And then I think you're right. I think society must be defended as really good about this, but I think placentas are missing.
Yeah. That's for sure.
That kind of dependency, that border, that's such a relationship of dependency that's so, none of us are here but by virtue of that
Yeah.
dependency, right? It might be an antagonistic dependency eventually, but, right, like for a while it had to not be. It had to be like, just, it seems like brute dependency.
And so how is the placenta a border? I think I have my own idea, but I want to hear what yours is, so
Okay.
I don't sound crazy.
Oh no, then I want to hear yours
I
first. It seems like it's a border, it's a blood border is one way that medical people talk about it. Because there's no blood transference, and so it creates a border between circulation systems, which is why you could give birth to somebody who can bear children could give birth to a child who doesn't have the same blood type. It's necessary actually, right, with that kind of border. But we would also say the placenta sets up precisely what is both the possibility of the fetus and the possibility of the not mother, right? So it has that in-between status.
Yeah. So I totally agree with that, and that is absolutely a material border. I think my emphasis is a bit on the social. So that the placenta can become a social. No, it is.
Become
But-
or already is.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
I mean, because in one sense it's
Yeah.
a condition for the social, but the
Yeah.
question is, I think when the question of power enters that, the control over the placenta, for me that's a question of social division, whereas
Right.
the placenta in abstraction, like as a concept,
Yeah.
you know, that's not exactly the focus of this,
Totally.
although it's a
No,
cool
I-
concept.
No, I
but-
take it. I just was.
But I'm kind of
I take it,
focusing on the more social control of it. So the way in which the placenta is socially managed,
Right.
and seen as a division, and what type of division, so
Right.
that's going to vary historically too,
Right.
and how it functions as a social form of division, and so there's not a universal there. That's why I'm hesitant here,
That's interesting,
because I don't
okay.
think there's a universal concept of placenta, and I don't think it universally does anything the same across all time and
Right,
space.
right,
And
right.
so I don't want to create another a priori placental transcendental or something like that. Like I want
That's
it.
okay. Are we ready?
Work has already been done.
But I would want to say that the placenta is a site where division occurs, and that we socially produce that
Yeah.
differently at different historical periods,
Right.
and I hate to defer, but I think also an empirical, like we just have to look and see how
Right.
it's being managed and what way does it function as a border, not does it or doesn't it, because I think it probably always does. The question is how.
Right. And in like the U.S.-Mexico border, it seems like placentas are playing a really big role in the technology of that regime.
We'll have to talk more.
Okay. Thank you for entertaining me.
Yeah, no, that's good.
All right, so it's, all right. I'm just gonna ask the question because you said There's a fourth category. Somebody has to ask it.
Somebody took the bait.
Somebody has to ask it, so it's gonna be me.
I don't know if this is gonna fit Sarah's
Oh, please,
schema,
I hope
placenta
so.
schema, the fourth one.
Oh, yeah, it does.
It does? Spoiler alert, it does. The border is not reducible to space. So a fair bit of border theory is like spatial analysis, spatial term. Geographers love them some space. Everything's spatial, everything's a scape of some kind. And so I'm trying to kind of like carve out a little border theory which is based on motion, movement, and kinetics as primary and not space. And maybe that sounds weird, but I do think there's an important distinction to be made because the analysis is completely different in how you would analyze something as spatial
Yes,
rather
yes.
than as
Actually, in the geography class right now, they talk a lot about space.
yeah, they love it. They love space. They love territory. It's like the big words. I can't erase this, but
There is an eraser to the left.
oh,
Not left.
this has chalk, but
Yeah.
hopefully I'm not destroying the board here.
We tried it.
So
It's fine.
this is. I mean, I'm not pretending to offer a full defense here, but let me just give you the schematic. Like, there's like only 2 paragraphs in here, but I think that space is secondary. And there's a metaphysical question at stake. What's more primary, space or movement? The historical answer to that is, well, mostly mind, God, then time, then space. That's it. So, but I mean, it's more complicated. But there's a history of privileging these certain metaphysical categories, and I want to invert that and show movement as primary. And here's but then if you do that, you have to explain space with respect to movement. So.
Yes, right. I assume most of us done the critique of pure reason.
Yes. So so if we're starting with flows of movement, so this is in the next chapter where it sort of lays out the conceptual framework for understanding borders. But the idea is that you have a flow that loops back over itself. And I mean, this is kind of a general metaphysical point, but that flows overlap with themselves and they produce the interiority. So you have the inside and outside as a secondary result of the fold. So the folding of reality is primary and the interior and exterior of that are secondary. That probably requires much more explanation than I can possibly give to you now. But in terms of inclusion and exclusion, I don't want to say like there's no such thing as exclusion. No, of course there is. It's just not primary. We shouldn't base our political analysis on inclusion and exclusion as the primary form of division. Yes, it occurs, no doubt. It's important to distinguish how this happens, but my point is that this process, like this is a continual moving flow, which simply folds back over itself, producing what appears to be inside and outside, but which is in fact the result of the primary process of flow and recirculation. So it's a question of when you get to a certain point, the bifurcation point, right? And it either goes this way or it goes that way. So you have your kind of border at the very sort of infinitesimal limit at some point, and then a sort of disputed zone where that's being disputed, and then you have a process of recirculation. So it makes a mark and then recirculates it, and then it also expels some other point. So you have a process of expulsion and then sort of expansion as this zone begins to be increased and organized and so on, and importantly recirculated. So social circulation, I think, is important and primary, and space is and interior, exterior. Those are all just relative terms. Not that they don't exist, but just
Yeah, right. Space it's critique of pure reason. Space allows space is a result of movement and makes movement possible, but movement is primary.
no. In critique of pure reason?
It's been a while since I've done it.
Been too long. Yeah, that's like no way. Kant is extremely clear in the Transcendental Aesthetic that actually it's time is the inner sense, space is the outer sense, and the condition of movement is in fact like actually it's tertiary for Kant really.
Yeah.
Time, space, then we have locomotion and movement.
Yes, but you want to primary say movement first.
Yeah, and I'm inverting that, and I think very few philosophers in history of philosophy have done that, but I'm in that tradition of trying to recover that for a border theory.
Yeah, we have one last question.
I just have a question about this recirculation.
Mhm.
Is any of the recirculation excess to what is coming before the border point in any form?
What do you mean by excess?
Well, I just wonder if if you keep going forward, you know, like towards the arrow,
Uh-huh.
that is maybe a contained or a surveilled motion. And so this recirculation, is that the excess, or could we call it anything?
Well, if you were gonna call anything excess, it would probably be this.
Ah.
My forgiveness to everybody else, but we're in an anti-Oedipus class right now, so we're talking a lot about waste and excrescence. And anyway, this is like the waste flow, if you will. It's an expulsion or a sort of rejection from the social.
I had it inverted.
The social order, and the recirculation is what's inside. Like here's your people, here's your citizens. When in fact maybe there's all kinds of exceptions, and this line doesn't necessarily just go out into nowhere, but it's going to connect up to other loops. In fact, it's quite complicated, but it's a very knotty structure. Like there's tons and you have to imagine a lot of different loops. But the metaphysical point here about space is just simply that it was primary. But I think there is a social process of expulsion. So that's what the first book did on the migrant, which it's basically radicalization of Marxist theory of primitive accumulation, which is to say, or what David Harvey calls like primitive accumulation by dispossession. But my logic is expansion by expulsion, because I don't think that it's strictly limited to capital. That every social formation requires an expulsion so that it may expand. Now there's a lot of unpacking there, I know, but the idea is that expansion and expulsion, circulation and recirculation, that's the primary conceptual framework, and not something like inclusion or exclusion, or sovereign decisions. Not that they don't exist, they're just very secondary to the primary processes, the social processes.
All right, well, we can take the conversation out to the reception. Let's thank our speaker one more time.